What is going on, SamCentre? I'm your host, Sam, and it's a little bit different look to today's episode. Obviously, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, we're still going to run SamCentre all the same, but on the off days, we're going to put out content like this dedicated around specific topics, going a little bit more in depth on them, because that's what we're interested in talking about. Today's rant is the state of the lightweight division in the UFC. 155 pounds. We have the whiteboard beside me. We're going to get into it. One thing that I ask before we start the episode, please like, please comment, please subscribe, go follow us on Instagram, check out the shorts tab, lots and lots of interesting content. If you like this form, let me know in the comments. If you prefer the long form SamCentre videos, don't worry, they're not going anywhere. Let's get into it. 155-pound division, otherwise known as lightweight, has been one of the most exciting divisions in the UFC for years. Stars like Conor McGregor and Khabib Nurmagomedov in more recent times have dominated the division, but obviously guys like BJ Penn, Benson Henderson, Eddie Alvarez, Rafael Dos Anjos, these guys built the 155-pound division and deserve a lot of credit for leading the sport to where it is today. And now you see it paying dividends. There's some good prospects. There's a lot of exciting fights in the top 15. But you look at the top and it's kind of logjammed with a lot of the same names. And so let's break it down in this video. We talked about having the whiteboard. At the end, we're going to do some MMA math. But let's remind ourselves of the top 15 at 155 pounds. Starting down at the bottom, Rafa Garcia. He's a guy fairly exciting. He'll go out there and he'll strike. He'll look to finish fights. And that's good to have as that top 15 gatekeeper. I think if a few different fights go his way, maybe he can move up a little bit. But a top 20, top 15 guy in Rafa Garcia, probably not contention for the title anytime soon or at any point, but a good guy to keep around in the weight class. Moving up, we have Grant Dawson. And this is an interesting character, as in more recent times, he's actually put on some pretty good performances and has put himself firmly in the top 15. I don't know if we'll ever see, in the same way as Rafa Garcia, a Grant Dawson title run. However, he could seriously put himself and cement himself in that top 10, top 15 as a gatekeeper for the rest of his career. And in the UFC at 155 pounds, that is honestly nothing to be ashamed of. There's a lot of good fights for you. You'll be exciting. You'll be on main cards. We keep Grant Dawson around. Moving on, Rafael Fiziev, a guy that most recently won in the main event against Manuel Torres. So he can stay at that level similar to what we talked about with the other guys, where he remains that top 10 gatekeeper, beating a guy like Manuel Torres and showing us that, there's levels to this sport, that if you want to break into the top 10 in this division, you need to beat a guy like Fiziev. And I think you probably aren't going to talk about him in title contention anytime soon. You look at his losses to Gaethje, you look at him really not having any winnable fights, I don't think, in the top 5 when we get there. So, good guy to keep around, a guy that you can put on the main cards. He will always deliver. Moving up, Dan Hooker, I think he's probably done. Recently we've seen him go out there, lose to high-level fighters, but still lose and not really look super competitive in either of his fights. He did have the guillotine attempt on Benoit Saint Denis and a fairly competitive fight in that one, but we talked about it. Dan Hooker puts on his 15-minute fights, his backyard scraps. I don't think that he's looking to contend for a title anytime soon. He has really no argument against anyone in the top 5, similar to other guys, and I'm not sure he's fully interested in just fighting out and being that top 10, top 15 gatekeeper. If he does, there's some pretty exciting legacy fights out there, maybe some older names that he can match up with, have a couple money fights before he retires, but I think Dan Hooker might be done and will most likely be dropping out of the top 15, depending on some of the results that we'll talk about a little bit later in the video. Moving up, Tom Nolan, I think he is in contention for the best prospect in the division. 26 years old, he's been able to prove time and time again he can strike, he can defend takedowns, and he can put on impressive performances in there. He needs to prove it now against some of the higher guys in the weight class. We'll talk about it a little bit later. I think I have some potential matchups that you make, including Nolan, including maybe another prospect that we'll talk about a little bit later. But regardless, you don't need to rush him. He's 26 years old, and he is part of the class that will take over once the top of the lightweight division starts to age out a little bit, as we're going to talk about. Mauricio Rufy, a guy that if the UFC wants, they might end up pushing a little bit, but he sits firmly in the rankings, and I think he's exciting. There's a lot of matchups that maybe aren't great for him, but he's going to be in there. If the UFC is smart with things, he's probably going to end up fighting for an interim title belt, something like that, a number one contender fight in at least one or two fights. We're going to do a who fights who matchup next, but I think that's what happens. I think Rufy ends up fighting somebody within that top five, one of the gatekeepers of the top five at lightweight, and we really see what he's made of. Moving on, we have Quillen Skalid, and I think he is also one of the best prospects that we have in the division. It's between him and Tom Nolan. We're going to have to see Quillen fight Gamrot coming up and see what he looks like there. But if he wins that, he is also firmly in contention to be able to challenge one of the top five at this division. Then we have Benoit Saint-Denis, obviously suffering a first round defeat against Paddy Pimblett. I'm not entirely sure where you go with Benoit at this point. I think he stays as a top 10 gatekeeper in the UFC, similar to a lot of other guys that we talked about earlier in the video. He's able to put on exciting fights. He's going to test your will in there. And regardless of anything, he won't quit. He's going to look to do damage. And so that's good to have with some of these prospects to really test to see if they're UFC level. Money Moicano, a guy that we all love, and I think at this point, probably a podcaster. I can't imagine that Moicano wants to keep fighting. And if he does, there are matchups out there that he can win. It's not like he's completely washed. His chin isn't gone. He proved that against Chris Duncan. But I just don't know what is left for him to accomplish. He got his money fight by stepping up there in short notice, challenging for the title. Proved that he was not at that level. So I think keep him, again, a top 10 gatekeeper. We need guys like him if he wants to fight. But at 37, being one of the bigger streamers in Brazil, I think we've probably seen the last of Money Moicano. Matthias Gamrot, he's going to do exactly what he does currently. He's going to be in there as a gatekeeper. If he's able to go out there and put on a really impressive performance against Quillen, then maybe you give him an argument to be able to challenge, maybe not Charles, maybe someone like a Paddy against Gamrot, if he's able to go there and beat Quillen. I think he probably loses against Quillen, but we're going to have to see that matchup play out. Regardless, a good top 7-ish gatekeeper. Paddy the Batty Pimblett, a guy that is going to be looking at that title contention. He has an argument to rematch the current champion. Obviously, he lost decisively to Justin Gaethje, but it was still a really fun fight. He didn't look as bad as Ilia did, so there's some history between him and Ilia. We'll talk about that a little bit later on in the video. Do we do him versus Max? Him versus Rufy? What are we going to do? Because he needs to fight somebody now in that top 3, in that top 4. We need to see what Paddy's made of. He was obviously defeated by the champion, but Justin is able to beat a lot of guys at 155 pounds. Max Blessed Holloway was able to defeat Conor McGregor recently. That doesn't say a lot for his title hopes at 155 pounds. I think he really needs another signature win, obviously dropping to Ilia, dropping to Charles. He has a win and an impressive knockout win against the current champion in Justin Gaethje, so there might be an argument for Max that we'll make later on. Charles do Bronx Oliveira, the GOAT. I think he has the best argument to be the next up for the title, at least a number 1 contender fight. Obviously the most finishes in UFC history. My opinion, my favorite fighter ever at 155 pounds. I think he's the GOAT, but there's an argument to be made for a lot of guys. Ilia Topuria, same sort of thing. He obviously just got beat quite decisively against Justin Gaethje. We all saw it happen at the White House card, but he has wins over Max Holloway, over Charles Oliveira. So there's a lot of exciting matchups that you can make. He's right in there for number one contender once he heals up and he's ready to go again. And then obviously Justin Gaethje. What's next for him? At least one more fight, but we need to know because he holds the belt and he is the key to the division. The other guy that we didn't talk about specifically is Arman Tsarukyan. I just don't know what the UFC is going to do with Arman. He seems way more interested in wrestling and going that path and putting out content, but he's obviously right in there in contention, beating Dan Hooker, beating Charles Oliveira. He has history with Islam Makhachev, so I think Arman has an argument. He just needs to be more active. So now let's talk new matchups, what we think is going to be next for 155, fights to make, the top prospects, and then let's do some MMA math. All right, now that we have all of that background, all that history of 155 pounds, and who's in the top 15, let's talk who should fight who and what's next for the belt. I have a couple matchups in mind. Honorable mentions, Usman Nurmagomedov is the current champion over at the PFL Bellator promotion, 155 pounds. Undefeated. There's nothing the Dagestanis love more than fighting not real high-level competition, so I doubt he's ever going to come over to the UFC, but he's still 28 years old, and he's really cleaned out everything that the PFL and Bellator has to offer. You know, he'll fight sparingly, but every time he does, he's a pretty big favorite. He did have a competitive fight a couple fights ago, but then followed that up with a very decisive victory. So I think if Usman wants to come over, he could potentially make some waves at 155. Maybe Diego Lopes. We don't know if Diego wants to move up. There was talk about him remaining at 45, but I think as long as Volk is there, maybe you allow him to fight one more time. I don't think so, though. There's a lot of good matchups at 45. As much as Diego has done a lot, I think moving up to 55, because he's already had trouble making the weight before, he could be potentially in contention if he does. We haven't heard from Yair Rodriguez at all. Maybe he could factor in. Mason Jones is a name who's also a pretty good prospect at 155 pounds, so we could be exciting maybe to hear about him in the future. And then obviously Islam Makhachev. I think he's probably done for good at 155. I don't think you make that fight at all. So if he's up at 170, the division has moved on for good. The one guy that might factor in though, if Alexander Volkanovski can defend his title again, what more does he really have at 45? There's obviously new matchups that you continue to make if you want. But if Justin is looking for that new opponent, maybe you just scrap whatever Volk has at 45, you move him up, you allow him to try and become the double champ, and you have him fight Justin Gaethje. I don't know, but maybe Volkanovski, even if it's on a short notice, I wouldn't be surprised if we one day, in a year, in 6 months, see Volk for the title fight at 55. But now let's talk about the matchups, because we have Quillin and Gamrot, as we talked about in our top 15 section. This could be a really important matchup for what's next in the division. If Quillin can go out there and put on another impressive performance against Gamrot, a guy who's a veteran, a guy who has fought at the highest level in the division for years now, the UFC has their star. My fellow mustached brother, it's possible that at 26 years old, 27, he's going to be fighting in the top 5 of the UFC. If it's more of a veteran lesson or maybe a hard-fought decision, then we might see the UFC be cautious with him. But giving him Gamrot is already a pretty high-level fight. I don't know what they're really thinking, because he's only 26. They're hoping maybe they have that star infuse new blood into 155, because as we get down the list, a lot of these guys have fought each other before, and so I think the UFC wants something exciting in there. Tom Nolan, I think what you do with him, something like a Jai Herbert or maybe a Kyle Nelson, someone who's going to strike and someone who's going to be hittable, and not like it's a layup fight though, right? Jai Herbert knocked down Ilia Topuria. That's pretty much what he's the most known for. But in recent times, he hasn't been the most competitive, but he's still a top 50, 155 pounder in the world. And then you look at similar for Kyle Nelson, a guy who has gone out there and been able to do quite a bit of work recently. Looked pretty good at 155, so I don't think he's a world beater by any means, but that would be what I do for Tom Nolan. You don't need to rush him. It's interesting what they're doing with Quillen compared to Nolan. They're moving them up at completely different rates. Obviously, the level of competition has also been different, where Quillen has fought, the guys like Beneil Dariush, and fought at a little bit higher level, where we're talking about Tom Nolan's best win being a Faris Ziam. But still, both being 26, both being prospects in this division, I think you go Nolan versus Jai Herbert or Kyle Nelson. For Mason Jones, an Esteban Ribovic, a Michael Johnson, a fight like that makes the most sense to me. You don't need to rush him as well. He's looked pretty good in his last couple wins. He's shown, though, that he's extremely hittable. So maybe the Michael Johnson fight would expose a lot of flaws in his game, whereas the Esteban Ribovic fight I think would be exciting. Both guys pretty sloppy, but would look to get after it. For Mauricio Rufy, I think we go Ilia Topuria or Max Holloway, Diego Lopez, something like that. I think you need to give him a fight where he's going to look favorable in it, because if you give him like a Paddy the Batty, if you give him even like a Gamrot, I'm a little bit worried that he just gets wrestled the whole time and then the Rufy hype train dies where it began. Because that's what happened with Conor, obviously, when he went against Khabib. And you look at a guy like Rufy, he has the potential to be that star, show high level in the striking. So let's give him a striker. If Yair is ready, maybe he factors in. But I think Rufy at this point, he's pushing for the title. The UFC wants that fighting nerd, somebody to be able to come out of that Brazil region and become a star again. So I imagine they go Rufy against Max Holloway or Ilia Topuria. That would be what I think is a good fight coming up. Moving on, we'll talk Max, Ilia, Charles, and Justin. And then there were 4. Well, I mean, technically 5 if we want to talk Arman Tsarukyan. I think we'll talk about him a little bit, but again, like I said, Arman needs to go out there and be a little bit more active, because everybody else in the division is consistently being active. They're putting on fights, and they're putting on performances where you just going out there, wrestling Tony Ferguson, wrestling Michael Chandler, it's not that impressive for us. So let's talk the final 4 like it's March Madness, like whatever it is. The current champion, Justin Gaethje. We have Ilia Topuria, Max Holloway, and Charles du Bronx Oliveira. And so if we're talking about the 4, we have the whiteboard. Let's get into it. So let's start off. First and foremost, Max Holloway defeats Charles Oliveira. Max greater than Charles. Okay. But then, what happens after that? Charles goes out there and defeats Justin Gaethje. Charles greater than Justin. What happens after that? Max Holloway goes out and defeats Justin Gaethje, the current champion of the world. Max greater than Justin. Ilia Topuria then goes out there and defeats both Max Holloway and Charles Oliveira in impressive back-to-back knockout fashions. So, Ilia greater than Max. Ilia greater than Charles. Then, of course, this has to happen. Justin Gaethje goes out there, puts on an impressive performance against Ilia Topuria, defeats him by TKO, and then we're talking champion of the world. So Justin greater than Ilia. And of course, to wrap it all up, Max Holloway has defeated Justin Gaethje. Charles Oliveira has defeated Justin Gaethje. And Ilia Topuria has defeated both Max Holloway and Charles Oliveira. So in my opinion, the only thing that you do is you allow Justin Gaethje to retire, because this is where we're at with our MMA math. It makes absolutely no sense to me. However, there's one answer, and I think I've come to the conclusion. Alexander Volkanovski, Diego Lopez, 3. Let's run it. Thank you for joining us on this special edition of SamCentre. I hope you enjoyed. Let us know in the comments what you think. Obviously, what is next for Justin Gaethje is going to be whatever the UFC decides. You know, his manager said someone he's never fought before. Let's see if that's true. I think there's too much history in the division and too many guys with an argument to jump someone like an Arman or jump someone like a Rufi over Charles Oliveira, over Max Holloway, over Ilia Topuria. But we'll see. The UFC is an entertainment company first and foremost, and the rankings oftentimes do not dictate who fights next. I hope you had fun. SamCentre out.